Dawn broke soft over Daniel's homestead, painting the fence posts gold. He worked alongside his 3 children in the crisp autumn air, his weathered hands steady on the post-hole digger while 14-year-old James held the timber straight. "That's the last one, Pa," James said, wiping sweat from his brow. 12-year-old Mary handed her father the hammer, her serious eyes watching his face. Little Thomas, only 8, gathered the scattered tools into the wooden box. "You 3 head inside," Daniel said. "Breakfast'll be ready soon." The children trudged toward the modest farmhouse, their voices carrying on the morning breeze. Daniel watched them go, his chest tight with familiar longing. They were good children. They deserved better than a father who could only give them half a family. When their backs disappeared through the kitchen door, Daniel crossed the yard to the small barn. The structure leaned slightly eastward, weathered but sound. Inside, the smell of hay and leather wrapped around him like an old coat. He knelt in the dusty shadows near the back wall. His fingers found the loose floorboard without looking. He'd made this journey 1,000 times over 15 years. The board lifted easily, revealing the hollow beneath. The worn leather pouch sat there like a sleeping secret. Daniel lifted it carefully, feeling its familiar weight. His hands trembled as he loosened the drawstring. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, the ring blazed to life. The massive sapphire caught a shaft of morning light streaming through the barn's gaps, throwing blue fire across the wooden walls. "Not yet. Grandmother," he whispered to the empty air. But soon, her voice echoed in his memory, thin and urgent from that long-ago deathbed. "Promise me, Daniel. Only for a woman who loves you for who you are, not what you possess." He'd promised. He'd kept that promise through loneliness and doubt, through years of watching his children grow without a mother's touch. He'd kept it when women in town smiled at wealthy ranchers and overlooked the dirt farmer with 3 mouths to feed. The ring's blue depth seemed infinite. His grandmother had worn it in the old country, back when her family name meant something. She'd carried it across an ocean to start fresh in America, protecting it through poverty and hardship until the day she pressed it into his palm with her dying strength. Daniel returned the pouch to its hiding place, replaced the floorboard, and stood. His knees protested he wasn't young anymore, but something had shifted this morning, a certainty settling in his bones like the changing season. He walked to the barn door and looked across his land. 300 acres, debt-free. Good soil, strong fences, a modest house that could be more if he chose, and in the bank, untouched for 15 years. His grandmother's other legacy, the fortune she'd saved penny by penny, dollar by dollar, through decades of thrift and faith. Through the kitchen window, he could see Mary setting the breakfast table. Her movements were careful and precise, already developing the grace of a young woman. She deserved a mother to teach her things a father couldn't. They all did. Daniel's jaw set with quiet determination. It was time. After 15 years of waiting and watching and testing his own heart, it was time. The news arrived on Thursday afternoon when James returned from town with supplies. He unhitched the wagon while Daniel helped carry flour sacks into the house. "There's a harvest dance Saturday night at Grange Hall," James said, trying to sound casual. "Everybody's going." Mary looked up from her mending, interest flickering across her face. Even Thomas stopped playing with his wooden horse. "Miss Sophia will be there," James added, glancing at his father. "I heard Mrs. Patterson mention it at the general store." Daniel's hand stilled on the flour sack. Sophia. The schoolteacher who'd arrived in their frontier town a year ago, bringing with her an air of quiet refinement that set her apart from other young women. He'd watched her from a distance these past months. Not openly, that wouldn't be proper. But he'd seen how she treated all the children equally, rich or poor, how she lived modestly in the small house behind the schoolhouse despite her education, how she walked through town with her head high but her eyes kind. She wasn't like the others who flocked around wealthy ranchers' sons, measuring men by their holdings rather than their character. at least. He didn't think she was, but he'd been wrong about people before. That evening, after the children finished their supper, Daniel stood looking out the window at the setting sun. Behind him, Mary cleared the dishes with soft efficiency. James sat at the table pretending to read while watching his father's back. "You should go, Pa," James said finally. "We're old enough now. We can manage one evening." Daniel turned from the window. 3 faces looked back at him with identical expressions of careful hope. "Please, Pa," Mary said softly. "You never go anywhere." Thomas nodded solemnly, though he was too young to fully understand. Daniel felt the weight of their longing. They wanted a mother. They'd never said it directly, but it lived in every quiet moment, every gap where a woman's voice should be. "I'll think on it," he said, but he'd already decided. After the children went to bed, Daniel stood in his small room holding his Sunday suit. The black wool was worn but clean, brushed carefully after each wearing. He laid it out on the bed, then crossed to the dresser. From the bottom drawer, beneath folded work shirts, he pulled out the worn leather pouch. It felt heavier tonight, laden with 15 years of waiting and the weight of his grandmother's dying wish. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, the pouch cradled in his palms. Could Sophia be the one? The woman his grandmother had described, someone who would love him for his character rather than his possessions. There was only one way to know. He slipped the pouch into the inner pocket of his suit coat. His hands shook slightly as he buttoned the pocket closed. The small weight rested against his chest, above his heart. "Saturday," he said to the empty room. The word felt like a promise and a prayer. Saturday arrived cold and bright. Daniel spent the day working with unusual focus, mending harness leather and checking the livestock twice. The children moved around him with quiet excitement, sensing something significant approaching. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Mary heated water for washing. James brushed Daniel's Sunday coat until it gleamed as much as old wool could. Even Thomas helped, polishing his father's boots with fierce concentration. While Daniel bathed and dressed, memories rose unbidden. His wife Sarah, dying in the blood-soaked sheets after Thomas's difficult birth. The devastating grief. His grandmother appearing at the door 3 days later, already ill herself but determined to see him through the worst. She'd sat beside his bed that final week, her breathing labored, her hands cold. "Daniel," she'd whispered, pressing the ring into his palm. "This was my mother's and her mother's before. We were nobility once, in the old country. I brought it to America with nothing else. Grandmother, you should rest. Listen." Her grip strengthened. "When I give you this, I'm also giving you a fortune. I've saved for 40 years. It's enough to live well, to expand the farm, to be counted among the wealthy." Daniel had stared at her in shock. "But you must promise me something." Her eyes bored into his. "Don't tell anyone about the money. Live simply. Work your land. Test your own heart. And wait for a woman who loves you for who you are, not what you have. Only then give her this ring." "I promise," he'd said. She died 2 days later, for 15 years. Daniel had kept his word. He'd worked his 300 acres as though they were his only asset. He'd let the town think him a struggling dirt farmer. He'd banked his grandmother's fortune untouched while wealthy men courted women with gifts and grand gestures. He'd watched and waited for someone different. Now, standing before the small mirror in his room, Daniel adjusted his collar. The suit fit well despite its age. The pouch rested heavy in the inner pocket, its small weight significant as a heartbeat. "You look fine, Pa," Mary said from the doorway. Pride and nervousness mixed in her voice. James appeared behind her, his face serious. "Miss Sophia's kind. She don't look at folks the way the Whitmores do." Daniel turned to face his children. They stood together. These 3 he'd raised alone. Their eyes full of hope they tried to hide. "Will she say yes?" "Pa," Mary asked. "I don't know, sweetheart." Daniel reached out and touched her cheek. "But she deserves to be asked by an honest man." The ride to town passed in a blur. Grange Hall blazed with lamplight, music spilling through its open doors. Wagons and horses crowded the yard. Daniel could see through the windows the wealthy families occupied the best tables, their fine clothes marking them as clearly as brands marked cattle. He tied his horse and helped his children down from the wagon. Inside, the hall swirled with fiddle music and laughter. Autumn decorations hung from the rafters. The social hierarchy of their small frontier town displayed itself without shame, ranchers and merchants in one sphere, farmers and laborers in another. And there, dancing gracefully with young Thomas Whitmore, was Sophia. Her dress was simple but elegant, her dark hair swept up to show the clean line of her neck. She smiled politely at something Whitmore said, but her eyes held a distant quality, as though her mind wandered elsewhere. Daniel's children found seats with other farmers' families. Mary caught his hand briefly, squeezed it, then let go. The music ended. Sophia curtsied to Whitmore and moved toward the refreshment table. Daniel's feet carried him forward before his mind could reconsider. The pouch pressed against his ribs with each step. No turning back now. Daniel crossed the crowded floor, aware of eyes tracking his movement. Conversations paused mid-sentence as people noticed the dirt farmer approaching the educated schoolteacher. Sophia stood at the refreshment table, pouring lemonade into a glass. She looked up as Daniel stopped beside her, surprise flickering across her face. "Miss Sophia," he said, removing his hat, "might I have a word with you privately?" Her eyes widened slightly. Behind them, Daniel heard Mrs. Whitmore's sharp intake of breath. Whispers rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Of course. Mr. Hayes." Sophia set down her glass, color rising in her cheeks. They stepped to the side of the hall, near the corner where the lamplight dimmed slightly. The music continued, but Daniel felt the weight of watching eyes. At a table across the room, his children sat frozen, barely breathing. Sophia folded her hands in front of her, waiting, up close. Daniel could see the intelligence in her eyes, the slight nervousness in how she held herself. She smelled faintly of lavender and book paper. "Miss Sophia, I know this ain't conventional," Daniel began, his rehearsed words scattered like startled birds. "I know I'm just a farmer. I got 3 children and a modest spread, but I'm a good man. And I work hard. And goodness, is Daniel actually proposing?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through nearby conversation like a knife through cloth. Laughter followed, not cruel exactly, but amused and slightly pitying. Sophia's face flushed deeper. She looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. How forward?" someone murmured. Daniel felt heat crawl up his neck, but he pressed on. "My children need a mother. I think you're a good woman. I'd be honored if you'd consider what could you possibly offer her." "Daniel." The voice belonged to Mr. Caldwell, the wealthy merchant. He didn't bother lowering his tone. His words carried across half the hall. "She's educated," Caldwell continued. "She could marry any man in this territory. What do you have, a dirt farm and 3 hungry mouths?" More laughter. Less kind now. Daniel saw young Thomas Whitmore smirking, his father nodding approval. Mrs. Patterson whispered behind her fan to Mrs. Caldwell. The music played on, but half the dancers had stopped to watch. Sophia's hands twisted together. "Mr. Hayes, look at him," someone said. "Poor man's got nothing to offer a woman of quality." Daniel glanced toward his children. Mary's face had gone white. James sat rigid, his jaw clenched. Little Thomas looked close to tears, confusion and shame warring in his young eyes. The humiliation burned, but not for himself, for them, for subjecting them to this public spectacle. "Daniel, truly, I'm flattered." Sophia's voice was gentle, but her eyes skittered away from his. "But we barely know each other. This is all very sudden." The hall seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's hand moved unconsciously to his chest. feeling the pouch's outline through his coat. Was this what his grandmother had envisioned public mockery? Or was this precisely the test to see if he could stand in his truth regardless of judgment? I understand, he said quietly. I just thought... She thought you'd know your place, Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, her voice dripping false sympathy. Honestly, Daniel, the schoolteacher. Sophia winced at the words, but she didn't contradict them. The mockery spread like wildfire through dried grass. What had been whispers became open commentary. The fiddle music scraped on, but it seemed mocking now, a cheerful soundtrack to Daniel's humiliation. I suppose desperation makes men foolish, Mr. Caldwell announced to his table, his voice carrying easily. 3 children in debts, most like... What woman of breeding would choose such a burden? Now, Robert, his wife said, but her eyes glittered with malicious amusement. The poor man can't help his circumstances. Daniel felt Sophia shift uncomfortably beside him. She looked torn between pity and the desire to escape this awkward situation. Her eyes darted toward the dance floor where other young men waited, men whose fathers owned successful ranches, whose prospects shone bright and certain. Miss Sophia, I didn't mean to cause you embarrassment, Daniel said, his voice low. I apologize for the presumption. No, it's... Sophia's hands fluttered helplessly. You're very kind. Mr. Hayes, your children are lovely, but I don't think we're suited. I hope you understand. Across the room, Daniel saw Mary's eyes brimming with tears. She'd pinned such hopes on this night. They all had. James put his arm around his sister's shoulders. His young face hardened with protective anger. Thomas stared at his lap, his small hands fisted in his trousers. Of course, Daniel said. Forgive the intrusion on your evening. He started to turn away, the pouch in his pocket pressed against his ribs, a reminder of 15 years spent waiting for a moment that had just crumbled to dust. Probably for the best, Mrs. Whitmore said loudly. Can you imagine the schoolteacher married to a dirt farmer, living in that shabby little house with all those children? She'd be buried alive in poverty and drudgery. Mother, young Thomas Whitmore said, sounding embarrassed now. But Mrs. Whitmore warmed to her theme. I mean, what could he possibly give her? A life of scrubbing floors and mending worn clothes, no parties, no fine things, no position in society. Sophia's face had gone from pink to pale. Mrs. Whitmore, please. I'm only saying what everyone's thinking. Dear. Mrs. Whitmore smiled, sharp as a blade. You're far too refined for such circumstances. You deserve better than hardship and obscurity. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. Not his pride that was already broken. Something deeper. The belief that character mattered more than appearances. The faith that someone, somewhere, could see past surface to soul. Maybe his grandmother had been wrong. Maybe no such woman existed. Maybe nobility of spirit was a fairy tale, and the world ran on gold and status after all. I should return to the dance, Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wouldn't meet Daniel's eyes. Thank you for... I'm sorry. Mr. Hayes. She turned toward the floor where young Whitmore waited with an outstretched hand. The crowd's attention began to shift. The entertainment over. Conversations resumed. The fiddle picked up tempo. Life moved on. Daniel stood alone in the corner, feeling exposed under the lamplight. He'd never felt more foolish. 15 years of patient waiting, of testing and hoping, reduced to a moment of public ridicule. He looked at his children one more time. Mary was crying openly now, her face buried in her hands. James stared at the floor, his jaw working with suppressed emotion. Thomas had climbed into his brother's lap, seeking comfort. They'd suffer for this. Tomorrow at school. The other children would know. They'd whisper and point. His children would carry the shame of their father's presumption, his foolish reach above his station. Daniel's hand moved to the pouch in his pocket. The leather was soft and worn, shaped by years of handling. Inside, the ring waited, his grandmother's legacy, the symbol of everything she'd believed about love and worth and character. What was he doing? What had he expected that a beautiful, educated woman would overlook poverty for some abstract notion of virtue, that the town would applaud his humble honesty rather than mock his presumption? He'd been a fool. Worse, he'd made fools of his children. The worn pouch felt suddenly heavy in his pocket, weighted with failed dreams and broken promises. Sophia moved away toward the dance floor, her shoulders tight with relief at escaping the uncomfortable scene. Daniel watched her go, feeling the moment slip through his fingers like water. Well, that was awkward, Mrs. Patterson said to no one in particular, her voice pitched to carry, "Poor man. He really should have known better." "Indeed," Mrs. Caldwell agreed. "One must know one's place in society. It prevents such unpleasantness." Daniel's throat felt tight. He started to turn toward his children, to gather them and leave before the humiliation deepened further. But movement in his peripheral vision stopped him. Mary had risen from her seat. Tears streaked her face, but her chin lifted with defiant pride. James stood beside her, one arm around Thomas, his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. Not at Daniel, at the room full of people who'd mocked their father. In that moment, Daniel saw his children clearly, saw their loyalty and love, saw how they'd defend him even when he couldn't defend himself, saw the lesson he'd taught them without meaning to that hiding truth, even for good reasons, led to this public shame and private sorrow. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, but different words now. Not the deathbed promise, but something she'd said years earlier. "Daniel, the finest souls recognize each other regardless of costume, and if they can't see you, then they're not fine souls at all." Something shifted in his chest. Not quite hope, but something harder. Resolve. Maybe. Or simply exhaustion with pretending. He'd lived poor for 15 years to test his heart and find authentic love. But what had he really been testing? His own worthiness? The world's ability to see past surfaces, or his courage to stand in truth, regardless of outcome? Sophia had almost reached the dance floor. Young Whitmore waited with his hand extended, smiling his easy, entitled smile. The wealthy families watched approvingly, the proper order restoring itself. Daniel's hand closed around the pouch in his pocket. His children stood across the room, bearing witness to their father's humiliation with more dignity than the adults who'd caused it. Mary wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her jaw set. James's arm tightened protectively around Thomas. They were ready to leave, to walk out into the cold night with heads high despite their shame. They deserved better than a father who hid in shadows, better than a father who let others define his worth. "Miss Sophia," Daniel called out, his voice cut through the music and conversation. Sophia paused, half-turned, surprise flickering across her face. The hall quieted slightly, people glancing over with renewed interest. Daniel's fingers worked the pouch's drawstring. The leather was soft and familiar, worn by years of handling. He'd opened this pouch 1,000 times in private, always alone, always reverently. Never like this. Never in front of witnesses. "I have something to show you," he said. Mrs. Whitmore laughed. "What could you possibly—" But her voice died as Daniel pulled the ring from its velvet nest. He held it up, and the lamplight caught the sapphire's facets. Blue fire exploded across the room. Every lamp, every candle flame reflected and magnified in the massive stone. Surrounding diamonds scattering light like stars. The music stopped mid-note. Someone gasped. Then another. The hall fell into stunned silence. Daniel held the ring steady, letting everyone see its impossible beauty, its undeniable value. The silence stretched taut as wire, every eye fixed on the ring, on the blue fire dancing across its facets, on the surrounding diamonds that caught and threw light until the humble corner of Grange Hall blazed like a jeweler's window. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth hung open. Mr. Caldwell had half risen from his chair, his face slack with shock. Young Thomas Whitmore stared, His earlier smirk erased completely. Sophia stood frozen, her hand halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide and disbelieving. Daniel felt strangely calm. The humiliation had burned away, leaving something cleaner behind. Not pride, he'd never been a proud man, but dignity. Perhaps. The simple dignity of standing in truth. This was my grandmother's, he said into the silence. His voice carried easily now, quiet but clear. She was nobility in the old country, before she died. She made me promise to only give it to a woman who loved me for my character, not my possessions. He paused, letting the words sink in. Around the room, faces registered confusion, then dawning comprehension. The dirt farmer wasn't quite what he'd seemed. I've waited 15 years, Daniel continued. I've worked my land and raised my children and lived simply, testing my own heart and searching for someone who could see past appearances to the man beneath. His eyes found Sophia's. She looked stricken, caught between shock and something that might have been regret. I own 300 acres, debt-free. Daniel said, good land, well-watered, with timber and pasture. I have a small fortune in the bank, untouched these 15 years. My grandmother left it to me, and I've let it grow while I lived on what my hands could earn. Mrs. Whitmore made a small choking sound. But I didn't want a wife who married me for land or money. Daniel said, I wanted what my grandmother had with my grandfather, love based on character and respect. Love that would survive hardship because it was never built on comfort. He closed his hand around the ring, the metal warm against his palm. His children watched from across the room, their faces transformed. Mary's tears had stopped. James stood straighter. Even little Thomas seemed to understand something significant was happening. I've lived poor to test whether I could stay humble knowing I had wealth, Daniel said. To see if I could value simple things and honest work even when I didn't have to. And to find a woman who would love me even if I had nothing. The room remained silent, but it was a different silence now. Not mockery, but something closer to awe, tinged with embarrassment. Daniel looked at Sophia. I thought maybe you were that woman. Miss Sophia. You live simply despite your education. You treat all folks equal, rich or poor. You value books and learning over fine clothes and parties. I watched you for months and thought... He trailed off, then shook his head slightly. But I was wrong. You're kind, but you're also young, and maybe it ain't fair to expect someone to see what I deliberately hid. Sophia's face had gone pale, then flushed bright red. Tears gathered in her eyes. The fault's mine, Daniel continued. I tested without telling. I deceived even while claiming to seek truth. That wasn't fair to you or anyone else. He opened his hand, looking down at the ring one more time. The sapphire's blue depths seemed infinite, holding generations of love and loss and hope. My grandmother was wrong about one thing, he said quietly. She thought the finest souls could recognize each other regardless of disguise. But maybe that's asking too much. Maybe honesty has to come first. Maybe real love can't grow from deception, even well-intentioned deception. He closed his hand around the ring again and met the eyes of the crowd. Mrs. Whitmore looked away first, then Mr. Caldwell, then others. Shame-colored faces that had moments ago been smug with superiority. I apologize for the disruption to your evening, Daniel said. He turned toward his children. Time to go home. Time to stop pretending and start living honestly, even if it meant living alone. Wait. The word was barely a whisper, but in the silent hall it carried clearly. Sophia had spoken, her voice trembling. Daniel paused, his back half turned to Sophia. The ring pulsed warm in his closed fist, his heart hammering against his ribs. Please wait, Sophia said again, louder now. She took a step toward him, then another. Her hands twisted together, her face flushed with emotion. Mr. Hayes. Daniel, please. He turned fully to face her, Tears streaked her cheeks, but her eyes held something new. Recognition. Perhaps, or shame, or both. She struggled for words, acutely aware of every eye watching. Forgive me. I was almost foolish enough to refuse the finest man I've ever met. Mrs. Whitmore made a sound of protest, but Sophia ignored her. You're right, Sophia continued, her voice strengthening. I am young, and I was scared. Scared of what people would think. Scared of hardship. Scared of... She gestured helplessly at the room. All of this. The judgment and mockery and expectations. She moved closer, until she stood directly in front of Daniel. Her eyes searched his face, really seeing him for perhaps the first time. But you've shown more nobility in these few minutes than I've seen in a lifetime of so-called refined society, she said. You tested yourself for 15 years. You raised 3 beautiful children alone. You worked hard and lived with integrity even when no one was watching. You honored your grandmother's wisdom and waited for authentic love. Her voice dropped to something intimate despite the audience. And when the moment came, when you could have used that ring to prove your worth and shame us all, you were still honest. You told the truth even when it made you vulnerable. That's... She shook her head, fresh tears falling. That's real nobility. Daniel's throat felt tight. He couldn't speak. If you'll still have me, Sophia said, her voice trembling, I would be honored to be your wife and mother to your children, not because of land or money or jewels, but because you're a good man, the best man, and I was too blind to see it until you forced me to look. The hall erupted, not in mockery this time, but in gasps and whispers of amazement. Mrs. Whitmore looked apoplectic. Mr. Caldwell stared into his drink. Others seemed moved, their expressions softening. But Daniel barely heard them. He looked at Sophia, really looked at her, saw the sincerity in her eyes, the tremble in her hands, the courage it took to speak truth in front of everyone who'd just witnessed her initial rejection. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Not because you feel shamed into it. Not because of the ring. I'm not, Sophia said firmly. I'm doing this because in the span of 5 minutes, you taught me more about character and integrity than I learned in years of schooling. I'm doing this because your children watched you be mocked and humiliated, and you still stood tall. You still spoke truth. You still treated everyone, even those who hurt you, with dignity. She reached out tentatively and touched his hand, the one holding the ring. I'm doing this because I want to learn from you, to be worthy of you. To become the woman your grandmother described, someone who values character over comfort. The wedding took place 3 weeks later on a Saturday morning when frost still silvered the grass. The ceremony was simple but well attended. Grange Hall filled with townspeople, most wearing expressions of genuine happiness. Even Mrs. Whitmore came, though she sat in the back and left immediately after. Sophia wore a dress of cream wool, simple but elegant, on her finger. The sapphire ring caught the autumn light streaming through the windows, throwing blue fire across the wooden walls. Daniel stood beside her in his Sunday suit, his face peaceful as she spoke her vows. Mary, James, and Thomas sat in the front row, scrubbed and shining. When the preacher pronounced them married, the children cheered louder than anyone. The weeks that followed brought changes, not dramatic ones. Daniel had never been a man for dramatic gestures, but steady shifts that transformed daily. Life. He hired 2 men to help with heavy farm work, freeing time to spend with his family. The house got a new room added on, built with care and quality materials. Sophia's books lined shelves in the parlor, but the real transformation was quieter. It lived in how the children called Sophia Mama within a month. The word coming as naturally as breathing, in how Sophia taught them at the kitchen table each evening, lamplight golden on their bent heads, in how Daniel and Sophia moved around each other with growing ease, learning the small intimacies of shared life. Winter came early that year, by late November. Snow blanketed the fields and ice bearded the fence posts. But inside the Hayes farmhouse, warmth bloomed like summer flowers. One evening in December, Daniel stood in the barn putting away tools. The workday had ended well, fences mended, livestock fed, firewood stacked high against the cold months ahead. Through the kitchen window, he could see Sophia helping Mary with reading while the boys worked on arithmetic. His family. The word still felt new and precious. He knelt by the loose floorboard, lifted it one final time. The hollow beneath sat empty now. The leather pouch's long vigil ended. Daniel ran his fingers over the worn wood, remembering all the times he'd retrieved the ring. Examined it. Returned it to darkness. "Thank you, grandmother." He whispered. He replaced the floorboard and stood. The barn felt different now. Less like a hiding place and more like simple shelter. Honest and useful. When he entered the kitchen, warmth wrapped around him. The cook stove radiated heat. Supper smells filled the air Sophia had learned to make his grandmother's stew recipe, and it simmered in the big pot. The children looked up from their lessons, greeting him with smiles. Sophia caught his eye from across the room. The sapphire ring glinted on her finger as she turned a page in Mary's reader. She smiled at him, and he smiled back. A whole conversation passing in that look. The worn leather pouch sat on a shelf now, visible and honored. Not hidden, not secret, but displayed as what it was, a humble vessel that had protected something extraordinary until the right moment. Sophia had placed it there herself, wanting to remember the story it represented. "Pa, come see," Thomas called. "I got all my sums right." Daniel crossed to the table, leaning over his youngest son's shoulder to examine the careful figures. "You surely did." "Son, that's fine work." James looked up from his own arithmetic. "Ma says if we finish before supper, we can have dried apple pie." "Ma." The word was so natural now. So right. Sophia stood and moved to the stove, checking the stew. Daniel followed and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. She leaned into him slightly, a gesture of affection and trust. "Happy?" he asked quietly. "Very," she said. She held up her hand, letting the ring catch the lamplight one more time. "Though I still can't believe you hid all that wealth for 15 years. "Had to be sure," Daniel said. "Had to know my own heart and find someone who knew theirs." Sophia turned to face him fully. "Your grandmother was right. You know, about finest souls recognizing each other. We just needed a little help seeing what was there all along." Through the window, the last light faded from the western sky. Stars emerged bright and cold above the snow-covered fields, but inside, lamplight glowed warm and steady. Mary read aloud from her book, her voice gaining confidence with each sentence. James helped Thomas correct a stubborn sum. The stew bubbled gently. Outside, Daniel's horses moved in their warm barn, his cattle safe in their shelter. Everything in its place. Everything as it should be. Daniel looked around his kitchen at his wife teaching their children, at the simple supper cooking, at the worn but sturdy walls that sheltered them all. This was wealth. This was nobility. Not hidden or tested or proved, but simply lived. Sometimes the finest gold's found in the plainest rock, his grandmother used to say, and the truest love waits patient as the dawn. She'd been right. Love had waited, and when the moment came, when truth finally stood in light instead of shadow, love had recognized itself. Daniel pulled Sophia close, pressing a kiss to her temple. She squeezed his hand, the ring warm between their palms. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. But inside the Hayes farmhouse, surrounded by family and warmth and honest love, Daniel felt only peace. The waiting was over. Life had begun.